to my channel. I'm so glad you stopped by today because today we are finally going to do Toothless. I've had so many people request for me to do him and I finally got to him, so that's what we're gonna do today. Now before we get started, I wanted to run past you guys an idea I had for a mystery art doll challenge. I wanted to make it How to Train Your Dragon themed. I thought it'd be really fun to get all the different species from the movie, put it in a cup, and then see what we'd have to make. If you guys like that idea, let me know down below. Anyways, let's get started. Okay guys, so the first thing that we're going to work on for Toothless is we're going to work on sewing the body. So I'm going to show you guys the pattern pieces and then I'm going to show you how to put everything together. So right here is the main body piece, and you'll probably notice that it looks a little bit different than what I normally do. So with the front legs, I want them to be a little bit more sticking out to the side, so I have them disconnected and we're going to end up connecting them later to the body. And then for the back legs, I don't want them to stick out as much, so we're not disconnecting the whole leg. So I'm going to have the upper part of the back leg connected to the main body, but the lower half I'm going to have disconnected. And then over here we have the top and bottom of the piece. So the back piece is just going to be basically a nice strip of fabric that's going to go in between Toothless's wings. And then for the belly, it's basically the same thing, except once you get to the middle of him, you want to widen it so he gets nice and round. Lastly, you're going to need the pieces for the wings and the sails. So you got the main wings, the sails that go right behind it, and then the tail pieces. So for the main body, I want it to be nice and soft, so I'm going to be using this minky fabric for it. The only problem with this fabric is it's a little slippery for sewing and it's kind of thin, and I don't want it to bunch up while I'm sewing. So I'm going to be sewing another just plain black fabric onto the back of this. So what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to draw out all my fabric pieces on the plain black fabric for the backing, and then we're going to lay this on top of the other fabric and we're just going to sew the layers together. This will thicken my fabric and make it easier to put everything together. So after I have everything drawn out, I'm just going to pin my fabrics together and I'm going to follow all my lines with my sewing machine. Once that's done, you just need to cut all your different pieces out and then we can start putting everything together. While you're doing this, make sure that you sew around the little spot where we need to connect the legs to in the front. So we're just going to sew a little kind of button shape and then we're going to cut the fabric in between that. The first bit of sewing that we're going to start on is going to be the back legs. So I'm going to take the inside part of the leg and the outside part of the leg, which is connected to the main body, and I'm going to lay those together and sew down the front only. Then what we're going to do is we're going to take our belly piece and we're going to connect the two side pieces to this. So it's going to go right in between. Now this is actually the only bit of sewing that I can do for the body right now until we put everything together. So what we're going to do next is we're going to do the sewing for the wings and the sails. So the fabric that I'm going to be using for the wings and the sails is going to be a much shorter fur fabric. That way we can add a bit more detail with sewing, and it won't be so fluffy. So what I did was I layered two pieces of fur fabric together with the fur sides facing inwards, and I drew out my patterns onto one of the layers. I pinned everything together, and now I just need to follow all my lines with my sewing machine again. So we're just going to go around all of our wings and our sails and make sure it's all sewn together. When you're doing this, make sure that you leave an opening so you can flip everything right side out. So the base of the wing where it will connect to the body, that's where we're going to flip that right side out. Same thing with all the sails. Now I'm actually doing an older version of Toothless where he still has his red sail for one of his tail fins, so I'm going to end up doing one of the fins in red. So I'm just going to do the same thing. I'm going to sew around all my lines with my sewing machine, and then once we have the wings and all the sails finished, we're going to flip them right side out. After we have everything flipped right side out, we're going to start using our sewing machine again to add some line work to the fins and the wings. And then also the very top of the wing we need to separate from the rest of the wing so we can stuff it and add some wires to it. So I'm just going to be using a white pencil and I'm going to draw out where I want my lines to go, and then I'm going to follow that with my sewing machine. Next, I just need to stuff the very tops of the wings and then add some wires to it. Okay, so we have our wings and we have our black sails finished. Now we need to finish the red one. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be painting the little emblem that goes on it, which is just kind of like a little skull. So I drew out my little skull on a piece of paper, made sure it was the right size, and then I cut it out. We're basically going to be using this kind of like a stencil. So I'm going to take my pen and I'm going to trace the little pattern onto the fin, and then we're going to take some white paint and fill this in. Now I did have to do a few layers of this to make sure the white looked really nice, and then after the white dried, I painted on the little red eyes. I figured painting them on would be a lot easier than to try and leave a void spot while painting the whole thing white. After I was done painting, I let it dry, and then I took my red tail piece and my black tail piece and I sewed it to the end of the tail on the body. Okay, so now we just need to work on the leg pieces real quick. So we're going to sandwich the leg pieces together and we're going to sew down the front of it. We're going to leave the back open because we need that for when we put everything together. We're going to do this to the front and back legs, and once we're done with that, we're ready to move on to making the clay pieces. Okay, so we're going to start on the clay face first, and then we're going to move on to making the clay feet. Now before we start on the actual face, we need to work on those things. I guess you would call them, I'm going to call them horns because I don't want to call them anything else. I know they're kind of squishy and fleshy, so they're not technically horns, but I feel bad about calling them like growths or anything else. So we're just going to call them horns right now. So we're going to work on Toothless's horns that go around the base of his head. Now he actually has two very large ones on the outer portion of his head, and then there's two smaller ones between that, and then two smaller ones on each side of his cheeks. So what we're going to do is I started out with a piece of wire. I've got it bent so I can make two on each wire, and they'll also be easier to keep the same size this way. And then what we're going to do is we're going to add clay to these wires and start shaping them and rounding them off. Make sure that you leave them nice and rounded because they're not going to be sharp or anything like that. Now when you're doing this, it's best to make all of them all at once, that way you can make sure that they're proportionate to each other. So we're going to get all these horns finished, and then we're going to bake them for a little bit in the oven. So we're going to bake them for probably about 20 minutes at 275 Fahrenheit. Just enough so they're nice and hard so they're easier to add to the face later. Once those are done baking and have cooled to touch, we can start working on the rest of the face. So we're going to take a large lump of tinfoil, make sure it's nice and rounded because we need a kind of rounded shape, and we're going to start covering this completely in clay. You're going to get it completely covered, smooth it out, make sure you have a rough shape of what you want the head to look like, and then we can start adding the little horns to the back of the head. So I'm going to start with the smaller ones that go right in the middle. I'm just going to push them into the clay, make sure I like the position of them, and then I'm going to blend the clay into it so there's no seam. I'm going to do the same thing to the larger ones and then the other smaller ones. Now I want to make my eyes a little bit larger than normal because I want to add a lot of detail to them. Now Toothless's face has a lot of detail, but a lot of it's going to get lost since it's black on black on black, and I want to get a lot of detail in the eyes since they're the only thing that is not black. So I'm going to take two balls of clay, I'm going to smush them into the face where I want them, and then I'm going to take some strips of clay to make the eyelids and to go around them and shape the expression of the eyes. We're going to kind of push them in place, make sure we like the expression, and then blend in the rest of the clay into the face. After I added the eyes, I realized I needed a bit more clay for the snout because it was just a little too short. So I just added a little to the end of it and started blending it into the rest of the face. After that, I'm going to start using one of my tools and we're going to draw out where the mouth is going to go. So I'm just going to kind of roughly do it real quick to make sure I can get my line nice and even, and once I like it, I can kind of push in a bit more and start refining the shape of it. Obviously, we're going to leave the mouth a little bit simple because we're not going to have it open or anything, and with his mouth is closed, there's no teeth or anything, so we don't have to worry about adding anything like that. So we're going to refine that shape, and then we're going to add some nostrils to the face. So we're just going to kind of use our tool and just kind of push in a little bit to shape a tiny little nostril. So right now we have the basic shape of the face done. Now we just need to add some texture and some detail to the skin. So I'm going to take a washcloth and I'm going to push it into the clay for the skin and kind of rough it up. This is going to make it kind of bumpy and scale-like. After that, I'm going to take some really small balls of clay and I'm just going to kind of push them randomly all over the face to make some scales. Don't forget there's some little spikes that kind of go down the front of the face, so we're going to add those as well. Okay, so I'm really happy with how the face looks, so I'm going to put this in the oven at 275 Fahrenheit for probably about 45 to 55 minutes. Now we can start working on the feet. Okay, so what we're going to do for the feet, at first it's going to kind of look like we're making more horns, but it's a little bit different. So we're going to be using a wire for this, and we're just going to be building up the clay for the base of the foot. So we're right now just making the kind of like girth of the foot and the shape of it. Most of this is going to be covered with fabric, so we're not really worried about this, we just mainly want the shape correct. One little trick you can do with your feet while you're sculpting the base of them is you can kind of push them onto the countertop to make them nice and flat on one side, and then they'll kind of help the creature stand better. So we're going to roughly do the same thing to the front and back feet until we like the shape of everything, and then what we need to do now is we need to add some claws to these. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to cut tiny little pieces of wire, and we're going to stick it into the foot where we want the claws to go. Now after I have all my wires in place, what we're going to do to make it easier to add the claws to the piece is we're going to bake it right now. So we're going to put this in the oven at our normal temp, which is 275 Fahrenheit, and we're going to bake it for about 20 minutes. Afterwards, we're going to let it cool to touch, and then we can start adding the claws to the wires. Now to add the claws to the piece, what we're going to do is we're going to roll out some balls of clay, make sure they're nice and even so all our claws are the same size, and we're going to kind of cone them off a bit by kind of twisting them so they're pointed at one end, and we're going to push them onto the wire. Then we're going to just use our fingers to kind of roughly shape it to be a better shape for a claw, and then once we have all of our claws in place and we like the look of them, we can put our feet in the oven for one final bake, which would be 275 Fahrenheit for probably about 35 minutes this time. So all of our clay is basically done right now, we're just getting it to bake, and then once it's done and cooled, we can start painting everything. Okay, so our clay is out of the oven, it's cooled to touch, and we can start painting. Now the painting for this, most of it is really easy. The only really complicated thing is going to be the eyes. So what we're going to do is we're going to be painting our claws black, and we're going to go over the whole head with black. So right now we're just primering everything black basically. Okay, so everything is primered and now we're ready to start on the eyes, which are basically the only detail that we're kind of painting. So what we're going to do is these are going to take multiple different layers of different colors to get the right effect. So what we're going to do first is we're going to go over the eyes with a nice dark green. We're going to make sure that's completely solid and we're going to let it dry. Make sure it's dried completely. You want to make sure your layers for your eyes are dried completely, because if you go over with a different color and you kind of blend too hard, you're going to end up messing up the paint underneath, and then you're going to have to wait for everything to dry again, and you could make your eyes kind of lumpy by doing this. Once that's dry, what we need to do is we need to slowly add yellow to it. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the same paint that we already painted the eye with, and we're going to add a bunch of yellow to it to make it a bit brighter. You want to kind of do this gradually because we do want to kind of have it fade from a dark green to a light. So we're just going to add a little bit of yellow first, go over the eye, blend it into the dark green, and then we're going to let that dry, add more yellow to the same color, do another layer, and just kind of keep blending it in until it kind of fades to a nice green to yellow kind of thing, which will create more of a glow, and it really won't look yellow once it's done. After we like how it's blended, what we're going to do is we're going to start using just yellow now and just kind of go around the eye and brighten the middle of it up, and we're going to kind of outline where we want the pupil to go. Then we're going to take our black paint and we're going to fill in the pupil. Now after you have your pupil done, you're welcome to go back in like I did and add a little bit more line work to the eye, just to give it a bit more texture, but afterwards we're just going to add a little bit of a white highlight and then we're basically done. So I'm going to let all my paint dry, and then after everything is nice and dry, I'm going to go over everything with a layer of resin. So I'm just going to brush on some resin. I'm going to have to let this sit overnight to cure, and then the next day we can start working on putting everything together. Okay, it's the following day, everything is finished curing, and we're ready to put Toothless together. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with our wire frame. I just made a very simple one for this, and we're going to take the wires for the legs and run them through the holes for the legs that are on the fabric body. Then we're going to take our clay head and we're going to glue this to the wire for the neck. So I'm just going to put glue into the back of the head because it's just hollow full of tin foil. I'm going to make a hole for it, fill that with glue, and then push it onto the wire for the neck. We're going to make sure that dries nicely, and then we're going to take the fabric for the neck and we're going to start gluing it around the base of the head. Now before we add the back piece to this, what I want to do is add a little bit more detail to it. I want to add the little scale kind of scoots that go down the back of Toothless. So we're going to take 2 pieces of felt. I kind of cut the top of them nice and wavily, and we're just going to lay them together, and we're going to sew this right in the middle of the back. So I'm going to sew all the way down, making sure all the scales are in place, and then we can add this to the body. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the very top of this and we're going to glue it to the base of the head. So we're just going to glue this in place, let it dry, and then we can start sewing everything together. Once we have that glued into place and it's dried for a little bit, we can start closing up our neck. So we're going to start sewing down the sides of it, and we're going to stop right where we want the wings to connect. So now what we need to do is we need to take those wings that we have on a wire frame, and we're going to start adding the wire frame for the wings onto the wire frame for the body. So we're going to just lay that out and start wrapping it with another layer of wire. Once we have the wire frames connected, we can start sewing the wings onto the body. So I'm going to start with the under part of the wing, and I'm going to start sewing it to the sides of the body. So I'm going to do both sides, and then we're going to take the back and we're going to start sewing that to the tops of the wings. Once we get to the bottom of the wings, we need to start adding the other sails to the body. So I'm going to take those big sails that go right after the wings, and we're going to start sewing those in place as we're sewing the body closed. So we're going to do this to both sails, and remember, as you're going down the body, make sure you keep stuffing the rest of the body, because it just makes it a lot easier to stuff as you go. Once those sails are in place, you're just going to keep sewing down the top of the tail until everything is closed up. Okay, so the last thing we have left is working on the legs. So we're going to sew the fabric for the legs in place, and then after that we're going to take the clay feet for the back legs and we're going to add those to the wire frame. So we're just going to take a thinner gauge wire and we're going to start wrapping everything together. And then we're going to move on to the front legs and we're going to sew the fabric in place for those as well. After that we can add the clay feet to the front legs as well, and then we can start taking our fabric for our legs and start gluing them around the base of the feet. So basically we're taking the fabric for the legs, the very end of it, and we're going to glue this around the base of the claws. So we're just going to put some glue down around the base of the claws, and then we're going to kind of push our fabric in place and make sure it dries. We're going to do this to all of the feet, and then we're going to add a little bit of fur fabric to the bottoms of the feet. We're going to let the feet dry a little bit, and then after that all we need to do is sew up the back of them and make sure they're nice and stuffed. Okay guys, and that's how I made Toothless from How to Train Your Dragon. I had so much fun making him, and I really hope I can make some more dragons soon from the movies. I kind of want to make a Terrible Terror, the tiny little lizard type dragon that's in the very first movie. I thought that would be really funny to make. Anyways guys, I'm going to have him along with a bunch of other creatures hopefully soon in my Etsy shop, so check the links down below if you want to buy anything. Thank you guys so much for watching. Make sure to like, subscribe, do all that fun stuff, and I will see you guys next time. Bye!